We're now continuing the story of the Old Testament as we look at week 8, Atonement through Sacrifice. So first of all, let's set the context for where we are. We've already looked at the book of Exodus, and we talked about the fact that God has entered into a covenant with his people, the Mosaic covenant. And then we also saw in that same book that God told Moses to build a tabernacle. And this is really a wonderful high point within the story, because at the very center of God's people is the presence of God with them. And yet in the same book of Exodus, we also looked at the golden calf narrative. And this also helps us to see why Leviticus is so necessary. Because in the tabernacle, we see a holy God coming to dwell with his people. And yet we also find in the golden calf story that they are a stubborn and rebellious people. And therefore, because they have built the idol and worshipped it, they have offended God. And this is going to introduce us to the concept of sin and the sacrificial system that we find in the book of Leviticus. Because really the question that arises from the book of Exodus is, how can a holy God dwell with an unholy people? Leviticus is really the answer to that, because Leviticus describes the provision of the sacrifices, and this is really a gift of God to his people, where the Israelites are to offer up animals as sacrifices. And the idea is that the animal is a payment, or some have suggested even like a ransom, that causes God to be appeased because God is the offended party. But before we look at Leviticus, I'd like us to remember where we are in the storyline. So if you can take out your timeline and notice where we are in the section of Sinai. And in the previous section, we looked at the fact that God will dwell with his people. There's a picture of a tabernacle there with the glory cloud. And immediately after that, we find sacrifice provided for sin and impurity. Leviticus 1-7, chapters 16 and 17. We also have a picture of an altar there to remind us of the burnt altar, the altar where burnt offerings are going to be offered up. And we have, underneath that, we have priests from the tribe of Levi, and this is in Leviticus 8-10, and we also have a reference to chapter 16, which is the Day of Atonement. And then laws for a holy people, Leviticus 11-25. So that's what we're going to be looking at now, and then we're going to also, I'm going to introduce you to the book of Numbers. So if you can also take out your map and notice where we are, you want to be looking at the Exodus from Egypt map. And the Israelites are in Mount Sinai. They arrived in Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19. And the book of Leviticus takes place at Mount Sinai. And in fact, the Mount Sinai region is also going to be described in Numbers chapters 1-10, because it is in Numbers chapter 10 that the tribes leave Sinai and they're going to wander. We'll see them in terms of the wilderness of Paran, and then they're going to arrive at Kadesh, and spies are going to spy out the land. So this is really all the background as the Israelites are preparing to enter into the promised land. And of course, Moses is our key leader. So if you have your Bible in front of you, I would encourage you to turn to the opening chapter of Leviticus. And I'm going to just highlight a couple of things as you are reading through this to be mindful of some of the key themes that are in this book. So first of all, I want you to notice that Moses is the key character. And in fact, God is giving him these laws to Moses. And we also have the tent of the meeting in verse 1. It says, "Then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of the meeting." This underscores that the tabernacle has already been completed, and we saw that in the book of Exodus, and especially chapter 40, where God's glory comes down. The reference to the tent of meeting is another term used for the tabernacle, and what it really does is it reminds us that the tabernacle is a place where God meets with his people. This is the presence of God with his people. And we find in verse 2 that God gives Moses instructions, and he says, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of animals," and it describes from the herd of the flock. And then we have, in reference to in verse 3, there is an emphasis of the type of animal, and especially it says without defect. And from the beginning, we start to see the importance of the quality of the sacrifice that is given to God. And that actually is a theme that runs throughout the Old Testament. The animal is to be spotless or without blemish. And this highlights for us that God is wanting the best of the flock, because the sacrifice costs something. King David understood this many years later when he said, "I will not give to the Lord that which costs me nothing." That is a theme that runs through the book of Leviticus. I also want you to notice in verse 4 of Leviticus chapter 1, we start to see the burnt offering, and then we have the language of atonement. This term, the verb to atone, and there's also a noun with it. Sometimes it can have the sense of covering, but really what's going on here is that in order for the Israelites to be in fellowship with God, a sacrifice is required. And the sacrifice, the animal, the type of animal, there's specific instructions given, that when a worshipper has offended God through sin, and most of the sins are actually unintentional sins, when they have offended God, the underlying principle is offense against God. Sin leads to death. And yet through the sacrificial system, God has provided the death of the animal instead of the death of the one who has offended God. And so God, it is what we call a mitigated punishment. It is less than the sins deserve. And yet God has provided that there are certain instructions with who can bring the sacrifice and the types of sacrifices that are given. But God is the offended party. And so the sacrifice is a means of appeasing the guilty, the one who is guilty, the sins are going to be forgiven, but also appeasing the offended party. So you're going to see language of atonement throughout the sacrificial system. And really what's underlying this is how are God's people to be in relationship with a holy God, and the sacrifices are the means by which that will be accomplished. That doesn't mean that every sin, that there is a sacrifice for it. For in fact, for intentional sins like murder, committing adultery, and a whole series of them, there's actually the death penalty. But in the opening chapters of Leviticus, we have a series of offerings. You're going to find burnt offerings, grain offering, peace offering, sin offering, guilt offering, and then there's going to be the consecration of Aaron. And the burnt offering is one of those that is used in various contexts, and it's the whole animal is put on the altar, completely given over and devoted to God. So as you read through these, I want you also to remember that the sacrifices in Leviticus 1 to 7 are reminding us that when someone has sinned, that there is a punishment, a just punishment that is required for the offended party, which is God. And God provides the animal in place of the person who has offended God. You also start to see in these chapters the importance of the priest who is set apart. The priest is going to mediate between God and the people. So there are priestly garments. The priest is set aside and anointed. Wonderful ceremonies that take place and beautiful garments that represent the holiness of God, and the priest has holy to the Lord. Then in Leviticus chapter 10, you also see this is where we have the death of Aaron's two sons, and we are reminded that sin and the worshipper who has transgressed in some way, that it is a dangerous position to come before a holy God. And that's why we have specific provisions given to protect the worshipper from God's holiness. Because God is holy, that is given throughout Leviticus, that the Lord is holy. I, the Lord your God, am holy. God is set apart from his creation in his elevation and in his moral purity. And yet Leviticus is also a wonderful provision, a gift for God's people. I want you to also look at Leviticus chapter 16. This is what we call the Day of Atonement. This is one of the most holy days in the history, in the calendar of God's people. And when you read through the ceremony, you're going to find that there are several animals that are listed here. It begins in Leviticus chapter 16, reminding, the background is Leviticus 10. And then it says in Leviticus 16, verse 2, tell your brother Aaron that he shall not enter at any time into the holy place inside the veil. Remember in Exodus, we looked at the veil, the petition, because the Ark of the Covenant is behind the veil. This whole ceremony is instructions about how the priest, the high priest, is to enter into the beyond the veil on one day per year. I want you to notice the number of animals that are sacrificed. I want you also to notice that Aaron is required to offer an offering for his own sin even before he offers a sacrifice for the sin of the people. In this story, there are also two goats. One goat is going to be for the sin offering, but the other goat is what we call a scapegoat. It is going to be sent out. They're going to lay hands on it, and it's taking away symbolically Israel's guilt. And that is going to anticipate what Jesus is going to do on our behalf. So the book of Leviticus, even though it can be technical at times, and even though some of the rituals seem quite a distance from our own contemporary context, we would not understand what Jesus has done on our behalf without the book of Leviticus. So I would encourage you, as you read the book of Leviticus, and then read Hebrews chapters 9 and 10 and see what Jesus has done on our behalf in comparison to how Leviticus helps us to prepare for that. So the sacrifices are for both sin, primarily unintentional sins, and they are for ritual purity, because God is teaching his people the difference between the clean and the unclean. In other words, what does it mean to be ritually pure before a holy God? And if you take out the timeline, I have this just as a one-line summary, and it simply says, sacrifices provided for sin and impurity. And that's really a summary, a brief summary of the sacrificial system. In the study guide, I go through more detail. Also notice here I have on the timeline priests from the tribe of Levi. We've already looked at the tribe of Levi, this way back in the book of Genesis. The tribe of Levi is going to be set apart for service in the tabernacle. And when we come to the book of Numbers, you're going to see the tribe of Levi and 3 families in particular from Aaron, 3 families, and these 3 families are going to be responsible to move the tabernacle. So that's also important as you look at the book of Leviticus. As you're reading through Leviticus chapter 16, you may even want to read Leviticus chapter 17, because this chapter underscores the importance of blood for atonement. Why is blood so important? You see, blood represents life. And that's exactly what Leviticus 17 verse 11 says. And this is what it says. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. So it is the animal that has been shed, and then you're going to see in these rituals that blood is often used on objects, and it's being used in the holy place because it is representing the life of the animal, And it is, if you like, a payment, a ransom that is being paid for the life of the worshipper. Let me just take a couple of minutes to look at Hebrews chapters 9 and 10. Hebrews chapters 9 and 10 is going to contrast the old with the new. And so there is a reference being given to the old practice under the tabernacle and the ritual that is involved in the Day of Atonement. If you look at Hebrews chapter 9, verse 6, it talks about the fact that this ritual that is being performed. And in verse 7 it says, but into the second, this is the inner tabernacle, only the high priest enters once a year, not without blood, which he offers for himself and the sins of the people committed in ignorance. And I would encourage you to read these two chapters, meditate on them, because what you're going to find out is the writer to the Hebrews says that the blood of bulls and goats can never take away sin. And he's going to contrast it with Jesus's perfect, the spotless Lamb of God, perfect sacrifice, the once for all sacrifice. We don't repeatedly have sacrifices now because of Jesus's sacrifice. And the fact that Jesus, through his better sacrifice, cleanses us so that we then can have access into the presence of God. And so the writer to the Hebrews is going to talk about the old is being fulfilled with Jesus. And then he says in chapter 10, verse 19, therefore, brethren, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus. Verse 20, by a new and living way, which he inaugurated for us through the veil. It's remarkable. The writer to the Hebrews is saying that we now have access to the presence of God beyond the veil because of Jesus. And so he's going to say, let us draw near with confidence before the throne of grace. What a wonderful, wonderful chapter to meditate on. Let me just mention a couple of things about the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers begins with the numbering and the book ends with the numbering. What are the numberings? The Israelites are going to move toward the promised land, and so they are going to be numbered. But I also want you to recognize that as they move, and if you take out your map, let's just put it on so that you have the map in front of you. You take out the map. The Israelites are going to move in Numbers chapter 10. They are going to leave Mount Sinai. They're going to end up at Kadesh or Kadesh Barnea. And it is going to be from there that the spies are going to spy out the land. And you're going to see later in the book of Numbers that they're going to keep the map in front of you. They're going to try to pass through Edom. That doesn't work. It's not successful. And in fact, they're going to land up on the plains of Moab. And in the next map, in tribal allotment of the promised land, you see later in the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 21, verse 25, there's the conquest of Heshbon. And then in Numbers chapter 21, verses 24 and 25, it talks about the Israelites conquering that region from the Arnon River to the Jabbok River. You should be able to see those. And so the Israelites are going to end up in the book that they're going to end up opposite Jericho, about to enter into the promised land. And so there's lots of things that take place, but remember the main thing in the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 14, we have the spies spy out the land. They're going to be judged by God because they don't have faith. They're going to wander in that wilderness for 40 years before they move on toward the promised land. So we've looked at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, sacrificial system, Numbers, they're getting ready. The tribe of Levi is going to be central. There are some more laws given. They're getting ready to move. In Numbers chapter 10, they move. And then by the time you come to the end of the book, they're on the plains of Moab. There's been some initial victories. God's blessed his people. Moses is still the leader. And then when we come to the book of Deuteronomy, you'll find that they are on the plains of Moab, and Moses is about to give the law to the new generation, because the first generation has died out because they'd wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. So that's where we're headed for our next study.